This podcast, Strange, Rare, and Peculiar, is for kind of those in the know about homeopathy, deepening your knowledge, bringing you more information about what you need to know, and maybe what you can leave aside about homeopathy.
Homeo what?
Homeo what?
Morning, good evening, and good afternoon.
Yes.
Hello.
Episode 23.
23.
23.
What's it to be?
We're going to talk about your method book, your method book provides context for the conversation about methods in homeopathy.
That's why it was called that.
Yeah.
I actually like
that was really genius.
Thank you so much. Exploring the breadth, context, and application of different clinical approaches in the practice of homeopathy.
Yeah.
How about that?
Just because you explore them doesn't mean you use them.
I actually don't. You're correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you consider that book implied consent?
What does that mean?
It's sort of. I find it interesting that sometimes people will look at a book and make an assumption about the author's.
Consent for other people.
Yeah.
No, that's not the reason for writing it at all.
I know.
Oh.
But I've heard people sort of make an assumption that you utilize all the different methods that were in the book, when in reality you were just attempting to explore them. I mean, as writers, what we often are doing is just satisfying our own curiosity and then sharing it with other people, right? And so...
Yes. Totally.
Is that fair to say that was
no.
part of your...
It's totally fair to say, and in fact, now I understand what you're asking. That was not the motivation to say, "Oh, look, this is what I do." Hell no. The motivation was because students are massively confused.
Yeah.
And but again, it's the same reason for the case taking and the case management book.
Yeah.
Because I just saw, after a couple of decades, 2 generations of students that were tripping over first prescriptions, very often not really understanding, doing what they had been supposedly taught,
right?
But not really understanding that in this instance what they were doing essentially comes from the lineage of James Compton Burnett,
right?
With a very, very small totality, and that this student over here, by prescribing calcarb first prescription, was in the Kentian tradition.
Or maybe making a constitutional,
or maybe making a constitutional prescription.
Which maybe this is a little doorway in, is to sort of explore the ways in which having so many sort of methods that have come about in homeopathy not only is confusing for students, but it also, it's like every generation forward, it becomes more convoluted. And because I like food metaphors, I think of it, yesterday I was using an analogy about flavor profiles. Oh, that was last night. We had an open night. Okay, actually, this is how I think I'm going to approach it. So we have a potential transfer student coming from a school that teaches a variety of methods. And they asked some interesting questions about sort of individuality in prescribing and how we approach that. And I was using a food metaphor, and I said, there are, like, you have to choose your flavor profile.
Yeah.
Because if you mix sort of Italian food and Mexican, it's like close, but not the same.
Well, it's like me cooking.
Oh, gosh. We can't even go there.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't put cumin in a Florentine dish.
You don't put sardines in your smoothie.
Well, that's acute versus chronic prescribing. Don't use chronic symptoms for an acute. That's like putting a sardine in your smoothie. But I think that the more... Is anybody going to understand what we're talking about today?
Yeah.
We should probably also say we're in a different spot.
Oh, yeah.
We are sitting in our living room, which has created a completely different vibe. I had to fight the dog for a spot on the sofa.
Yeah.
And we're on a leather couch, which every time you move makes
creates
a
a
really
squeak.
loud noise.
Right.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But the more I do homeopathy, or the more I learn about homeopathy and practice to my best, I think that's how I would like to say it, the less I know. And the less I feel comfortable and confident in some interpretations, because it's a thing. Homeopathy is a thing. And it really does it has rules. But what I got, and I think I actually got this through the writing of my thesis, having to really articulate something for a non-homeopathy audience, right? To articulate something to an allopathic audience primarily, was to really settle on Hahnemann's very clear statement that homeopathy is based on natural laws, and that the world changes. So disease names change. The diseases we get, the way that we have complex autoimmune disease now, the way there's pandas now, and so on and so forth, that all that can change, but the natural laws on which the world exists don't change. Which means that it can solve any of the problems, or it should be able to solve the problems. And I would say, I don't think 100%. I think sometimes we step outside, make an isopathic or a tautopathic prescription. I mean, I think that's totally fair. What do you think about that?
I do. I mean, that's... I mean, for me, it's pretty rare that I would use tautopathy. I think in my 35 years or so, I've not done more than a handful or two of tautopathy. I use isopathy a bit more often, but really not that often either.
We have to define our terms for people who might not understand. So tautopathy is the use of a homeopathic preparation of a medicine.
Of a drug.
Of a drug. And so I would say probably the most used one would be folliculinum.
Yep.
Right? So folliculinum is made from synthetic estrogen. Is that correct?
That is correct, but that's actually not what. Because that's not a drug.
Well, birth control pills.
That's a healthy secretion.
I thought it was synthetic estrogen. Because if it was a healthy secretion, then it would be, what do you call it?
A sarcode.
A sarcode.
Interesting.
We should be better prepared for this.
I think you've just taken me into a murky field. Isopathy, though, is the application of same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a few examples of that for sure. In my own practice, using, like, say, white-tailed spider, or using...
in other words, using white-tailed spider for the bite of a white-tailed spider.
Yeah. And even a couple of examples of, say, actually probably mercury, in some of those cases not prescribed homeopathically, but prescribed because of a mouthful of mercury, which seems to be at the heart of it. But what you're talking about right there is what I attempt to describe as small totality prescribing, and isopathy and tautopathy are examples of that. But that's different, from some of the other methods of prescribing which have been promulgated by, kind of experts who, after years and years and years of practice, have said, "No, this is what's coming to me in my practice, wherever it's in London in 1800 or 1890, or Argentina in 1950, and this is what I'm seeing, so this is what I'm doing."
Let's get to that in a minute, because I think you're talking about Isiaga. Yeah. Okay. But before we get there, because I think since we actually started where we thought we would be later on in the conversation, but talking about this isopathy and tautopathy, I see a lot of clients who have seen other homeopaths, and we see this in our clinic, and they actually start with isopathic and tautopathic prescriptions, and they call it homeodetox. And there's this idea that by giving the same, that you're going to reverse some action. And no doubt that can happen. I mean, I just had a tautopathic prescription in my practice a month and a half ago. And it was a very clear case of never been well since. It was a person with complex pathology. Mm-hmm. I had first tried a remedy for the larger totality. It moved the case probably, I don't know, maybe 30%. Mm-hmm. But there was this one funny set of symptoms that were the most problematic for the client that did not fit into the larger totality and had come on after a particular medication. I mean, it literally derailed this person's health, and they've gotten incredible results from a tautopathic prescription.
Yeah. Nice.
I mean, yeah, I was very happy with it. And, I approached them with trepidation, but I feel like that's not the norm, because now that is, I mean, it's become sort of this idea of detox. And I respect it, and I know that, we're overloaded with toxicity and so forth and all the medications people get. But I do struggle to understand how, from the standpoint of homeopathy and what it was intended to be, how we can be sure of how that works and the and sort of the long-term impact or effect. But do you remember, I think we had a conversation with Farouk Master about this at the Joint American Homeopathy Conference a year ago. Mm. And he is very successfully using tautopathic prescribing in the hospital that he works in treating cancer patients.
Yep.
So there's clearly a place for it.
Well, I mean, what do you say? I mean, there's clearly a place for it. I've not seen any kind of hardcore research for it that answers the question that you're answering, because when a student would say, well, at what point would I employ this technique, then it just comes down to expert opinion. And expert opinion is kind of okay, but expert opinion is not what evidence-based complementary medicine is.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have, especially, if one of the goals that we have is to be able to really work within the medical system, sort of working in tandem with the medical system to really support, people's health journey, then we naturally become a part of a larger conversation. And that means that we're engaging with sort of the net effect of a lot of treatments. And I think it would change things. I mean, so I feel I don't like to say no to anything, because I always feel like being judgmental means you're just going to get smacked in the head later.
Oh, yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
And that expression, even a broken clock is right twice a day, time and a place for everything. Mm-hmm. I think for me, where I don't like the idea of is this overuse of tautopathic and isopathic prescribing that tends to be not the judicious use of one tautopathic remedy that's really evident in a case of where something has happened that sort of never been well since paradigm, but rather as an opening game.
So the challenge, there's a couple of challenges with that, because the examples, or some of the examples you've given, have been kind of recent, and sort of talking about what is now marketed as homeo detox, for example.
Yeah.
But there are examples in Greek medicine, ancient Greek medicine, of isopathy being used. The ash of scorpion for the eyes.
The liver of a rabid dog.
For rabies,
Wait, I'm going to look in your method book.
If you can find it.
In the Isopathy chapter.
Well, yeah, go for it, because you'll have to hurry up. But I mean, there's all sorts of examples that have been, cherry-picked to affirm that this approach gets a clinical result in over different periods of time, right? So at no point in those stories, when it says blah of blah used this isopathic intervention, it doesn't talk about how long did it last, what case management occurred with it, at what point did another clinical intervention take place, what else happened around it. It's the usual story. And so while that affirms that there's a history, and of course, then Herring comes along, then Father Colette, that French Dominican priest, starts using isopathy at no point do they provide clarity for us about the management of the person that is having that intervention.
Well, but Hahnemann is very clear.
Well,
in aphorism 56, well, the footnote to aphorism 56, that's where he gives Herring a serve, as you would say, because Herring, with his discovery of the saurine, right, Saurina, he discovered it in 1830, and then it wrote about it in 1833, and Hahnemann then hears about it, and Herring says, so this would now become what we call the remedy Saurinum. And, I mean, it's a little bit of a convoluted story because it also comes about just, his discovery was 2 years after Hahnemann's publication of the chronic diseases.
Right.
And so he's got this idea, I think, to prove scabies or the exudate from scabies as an isopathic intervention, right? Because Herring was, he was definitely dipping his, not just his toe, but his leg, in those waters and exploring. And Hahnemann, rebuked that. He says there are three forms of medicine. There's allopathy, there's isopathy, and there's homeopathy. So he creates a clear distinction. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the organon in front of me, but he says to assume that one could cure, scabies or the disease, the same disease with the, the diseased itch matter is preposterous, and nothing but calamity will result. That
nothing
part I remember.
But calamity.
Nothing but calamity. If only I could do a German accent, I think, because I think to say that in German would be even better. But there, so he's declaring Hahnemann is declaring a difference, but he doesn't say no. He just says it's different, or at least that's been my interpretation.
Yeah.
But you're right that the management of it would be difficult. I think
for me that's the key, because in my experience of homeopathy, cases need to be managed. Often 70% of the work you do with them is case management. And so, I use this intercurrent remedy. Okay, great, but how did you use it?
Yeah.
With what authority?
Yeah.
And why? Okay, I use this isopathic intervention. Great. Okay, why?
Yeah.
And how do we now teach this? There's zero clarity around the use of these small totality prescriptions, which I think are beyond confusing.
I think it's hard for students.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel confused sometimes about when, not confused, but I approach a problem with a healthy respect for the fact that you're giving an activated substance to someone, and you want to know what it's going to do. I feel better when I understand a person's reaction to a remedy. So, a lot of times, unless otherwise indicated, we're going to give as an opening prescription, as an opening, recommendation, we're going to give a remedy for the largest totality of symptoms that we can perceive, which sometimes is a small totality. Sometimes, you do a James Compton Burnett type of remedy recommendation. In other words, Burnett, as a master anatomist, as a pathological thinker, would say, fix the organ before you move on to the larger totality.
Well, the organ has hegemony and is interdependent. And so he's kind of saying both. I love what he says about that, because it's that, and just what happened with me then. Like, I had an itch in my right eye, and so I scratched it, right? And so the organ, the eye, dominates the whole in that moment.
Right.
And that's absolutely brilliant. It's like the same idea that if you're sleeping at night and there's a mosquito in the bedroom or in the tent or in the under the mosquito net, that will dominate, And so I think that particular genius piece of philosophy that links a medical approach to homeopathy and a medical approach and homeopathy is what makes his work absolutely appropriate for us when those organ prescriptions are used homeopathically.
I had a case that I learned so much from. I teach it when I get the opportunity to be the person who teaches Natrum sulfuricum. But this was a case that, this was a person who did beautifully. She'd had homeopathy before. She'd gotten good remedies before, but she arrived on my doorstep and I gave her, I think I made a mediocre recommendation and then gave her Thuya. It was great. And then that sort of did its action. Metaurinum, fantastic. And then as that remedy completed its action and it was evident that something new was needed, I was, sort of stumped to find something, and it took a few tries. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that I moved away from primarily psychotic remedies, Thuya and Metaurinum, and when I went through her case after, realized I moved to a more syphilitic presentation, which was just not appropriate for where she was on her, in her healing. Anyway, fast forward, and she had an asymptomatic liver issue, and because there were no evident symptoms, it didn't really factor into her case. And I remember going through Burnett and looking at all of his approaches to dealing with the liver predominantly, right? Because I felt like while she was not symptomatic, I could see the downstream effects of an under-functioning liver on her case.
That's it. That's exactly. In his language, he would say, these are the externalized symptoms, but the seat of the disease is the liver. Yeah.
So, and I wound up actually getting to Natrum sulf in a funny way.
In a convoluted way,
In a convoluted way, but it has been a remedy that helped her for years and years and more than a decade. And so a couple of lessons there, which were that, and I think what I loved about it is that I went to understand the organ affinity more deeply, and in the end came back to a remedy that fit the case more broadly, which then said that you can get the problem solved if you understand the case well enough and you recognize an organ affinity, which is what we do anyway, you're still getting the same effect. The difference would be if you're treating that organ very specifically with a tincture, right? Or a low-potency remedy, which Burnett would have done. And then if that results in a polypharmacy prescription, then it becomes a little bit more difficult to manage.
There you go. I mean, in a way, how can we separate the questions around method and different styles of prescribing and exploring all of that without a conversation of case management? I mean, it's difficult. I mean, obviously, I tried to separate them because I wrote another book about the case management part. But at the end of the day, case management, it comes down to, okay, well, what did you do? With what approach did you begin this case? And then, of course, did you use 4th or 5th or 6th edition of the Organon Prescribing Posology? Okay,
now I have a challenge for you that I never really, we've never really talked about.
Oh, I need coffee for this.
But you're not on the coffee. You want some? You're not going to like mine because I have some metabolism boosting powder in there.
I don't want any of that nonsense.
It's kind of
What's
delicious.
The challenge? I'm really excited.
Well, because I think that I would if I were to go back and think about this book with you. Let's say you hadn't written it, or if you're going to do another edition of it. I would be really clear that there are methodologies that are about. Wait, you're saying yup. Do you know what I'm going to say?
I think I do.
Do you want to?
No, I want you to say it.
If you could read my mind, girl. What
That's Gordon Lightfoot. He just died.
He did. He's been on my mind.
Ah.
We have to get our 70s road trip playlist on again.
Oh, shout out to Gordon Lightfoot.
I know. We love Gordon Lightfoot. Anyway.
I can see a lion. Anyway, that one.
Okay. So there are methods that are about finding a remedy.
Yep.
And then there are methods that are about totality and how we address a problem. And I believe those two things should be separated. And can I say a little bit more? Because I think that because I think that some of the contemporary methodologies that are about the exploration of additional materia medica, I have I have questions about some of those. And I say I have questions, right? Because, well, oh gosh, I'll open that door in a sec. But when you talk about ways that you use potentized substances and our assessment of their results, that's one thing. So to me, that's inclusive of isopathy, tautopathy, organopathy, and larger totality prescribing. And it's inclusive of what, this thing, the constitutional remedy, or what I would consider more prominent, the chronic remedy, the remedy that addresses the chronic issue most appropriately. Okay, then you stop there, right? Because that's about understanding philosophy and case management. Then you get into these other methodologies or the systems of homeopathy that fundamentally can change what we do. Or they are simply about finding more obscure remedies. In some cases obscure, in some cases not. I mean, I would say, in the early days of Jan Scholten's work, where there weren't provings for many of these remedies, his attempt was to create he was trying to establish a predictive pattern with existing information, just like Dmitry Mendeleev did with the, with his discovery of or system of the periodic table.
And being able to predict and know that, what was unseen and actually, even those elements that didn't exist at that point.
If I were to have a conversation with him now, I would ask him.
Mendeleev?
No, Scholten. Mendeleev, long dead. Scholten, not.
But go.
Oh, but I guess it could be one of those, like, if you could have a dinner party with anybody
exactly.
alive
That's
or
where I
dead,
thought
who would
you were
it
going.
be? Oh, okay, fair enough. But you know who I would invite to the dinner party of dead people?
Would you invite Levasseur?
No.
Oh, who?
Think.
Hahnemann?
I mean, obviously, but even more so.
Melanie?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
All right.
My French, though.
Not so good.
Okay. But you know what I would ask Scholten is, remember when Kent got in trouble?
Well, for making up Materia Medica.
Well, let's be charitable. He didn't make up Materia Medica. What he attempted to do was he wanted to take two elements, create a salt from them, and predict what their... And he made assumptions about what the Materia Medica would be.
Yep.
And he got slapped.
H.C. Allen.
Yeah, H.C. Allen slapped him, and he had to make a retraction. The problem is that Materia Medica is still out there, and people use it as if correct. So probably should explain that more. So for people newer to homeopathy, right? So there are remedies made from mineral substances. Some of them are straight up minerals, and some of them are a mineral salt. So you have, potassium carbonate, which is
ferrum iodatum.
Yeah, natrum muriaticum, which is sodium and sodium chloride. So if these have not been made into a homeopathic remedy and thus proved, in other words, a clinical trial done on a healthy person to show what those symptoms are, anything that we would assume about the remedy without a proper proving is conjecture. And you can, use some of the toxicological information if it exists, but you never get the full breadth and the characteristic symptoms and the strange, rare, and peculiar symptoms, which are often the guideposts to making an accurate, remedy recommendation.
Yeah.
And so, Kent tried that. Allen said, no, we don't play that game. And then later on, that's exactly how Scholten built out the beginning of his system. So, we can see that he was trying to fill gaps, but at the same time...
I've told you I was there for when he first started teaching all of those remedies from the Green Book.
And you left?
No, I didn't leave.
Oh, I thought you left.
I was too shy to have left. But I remember it was at the Society of Homeopaths conference, and whenever it was, I think it was 1992. I'm sorry. It could have been 1992. And he drove from Holland.
Right.
and literally the books were still warm.
Wow. Yep.
And he had a big stand outside and a big audience.
Yep.
And he started talking and really just going into, just taking people through the logic. His starting point was that he was, that he was critiquing, and there were big gaps in provings,
Yep.
traditional and modern provings. And so he was looking for a more solid method.
Yeah.
And therefore he was, at that stage, mixing his minerals.
Right.
And literally people just, one up, they left, another one up and left. And it was obvious in that instance that it was deeply uncomfortable.
I feel so bad for him. Like, that really would be horrifying.
I don't think it affected him.
No.
I think, if anything, it motivated him. But it was half the audience had gone by the end of the lecture. And it wasn't because it was a bad lecture. It was because this is controversial and I don't think I want to stay and listen to it. But that said, I like what you're saying to me. I don't know that I'm going to rewrite this.
Yeah.
Because, well, maybe that...
I could put it in my case analysis book.
What?
That distinction.
Sure. But let me describe... Well, there's two reasons to having another crack at this book. One is because I started with Hahnemann and Berningshausen, and then I said... And then I separated that and I said, now what we're going to do is look at small totality prescribing and go to big totality prescribing.
Okay, yeah.
But then I didn't actually end up doing that because I kind of went historically.
Right.
And so then I went, where do I put Kent? Okay, well, but Kent is... And then I separate... And the other motivation for the book, which I think is important, is because the what we call the little green book of Ian Watson... was actually a really important book for me when I was a student. And then I realised as I was going through it, actually, I don't think that's right, mate. There's a number of, and, with total respect to him, but I found that his chapter on, I think he called it physical generals.
Yeah.
Got very, very mixed up with a chapter on constitutional prescribing.
Right.
And then I realised, no, that's actually not right.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, then how do I do that? Okay, we need a chapter on Kent. We need a chapter on constitutional prescribing.
Right.
And constitutional prescribing, of course, actually being prescribing for extremely healthy people based on the features, their preclinical features. And signs and symptoms.
Which is very different than making a chronic prescription. And those two things have gotten
totally
convoluted
in
today's conversations.
So hang on, I'm making a few points here. I would go back and have another crack at the order of the chapters. I don't think there's anything... that's its second edition. Yeah. If there's a third edition, the other thing that I would do is I would say, we're deeper into the 21st century, and there are a couple of styles of prescribing, or quite methods of prescribing, that I deliberately left out of that book that have now taken hold within a section of the homeopathic world, not necessarily professional homeopaths.
You couldn't have imagined them.
No, because in the day,
you should say what it is. Protocols, yeah.
Back in the day, protocol prescribing, and I would say that I had my finger on the pulse of UK, US, French, Australian, New Zealand prescribing. Yep. I was in those, Asia, I was in those places a lot, and even India. And what was going on with protocol prescribing was essentially the Banerjees and that dynasty saying, you've got asthma, take this. Yep. This is arsenicum, whatever it might have been, whatever the protocol is. Take the protocol. If this does not work, see your professional homeopath. Yeah. And those protocols were delivered with that very clear message.
By doctors.
By physicians. Yeah. Who were taking into account all of the safety features and concerns and signs and symptoms 100%. And everything else. And that's how in India...
And it's meant to be small totality prescribing.
Totally, yeah.
Not large totality prescribing, which is very different than how it's being implemented here in the United States.
Today.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think a discussion at least around... Maybe even an historical discussion around what's gone on with that.
Yeah.
And the I suppose the more I was going to say the more sinister side, but I don't mean sinister. What I mean is that the extremely messed up cases that have occurred as a consequence of poor application of protocols.
I can't even believe it. I mean, I'm almost afraid to say it publicly that we see people who have a diminished level of health after the overuse of homeopathy, because I think that is, I mean, it's, we say, homeopathic remedies are safe, full stop, when we need to say homeopathic remedies are safe, comma, when used appropriately, But, but let's go back, though.
Hang on, can I just finish that part?
Oh, gosh, yeah.
So I think I would include something around that. An acknowledgement, and this is really important, acknowledgement that most of the people that are using protocols, maybe without the physician's disclaimer that I said before, are at heart trying to do the right thing.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so take responsibility for people, their own and their kids' health where are totally appropriate, but just not getting it right. And so, the lists, the spreadsheets of
I've never seen
of remedies
like
that are coming along with people whose health is still in a way broken and possibly not as resilient as it was before,
and not as responsive.
Right.
Sometimes not as responsive.
That's a concern. So I might have to have a little discussion about that. Might have to have a discussion about homeo detox, which in and of itself seems to be a method. Small totality method. But all in all...
Is homeoprophylaxis in here? I
No.
don't think you have that in there either.
No, because, I at the time, Dr. Isaac Golden was writing pretty well about that. At that time, or soon around the time that I was writing this, I wrote the foreword for his manual on homeoprophylaxis.
Yeah.
Just one of his books. Geez, it was the hardest thing I ever wrote. But he kind of dominates that space,
Right.
and does a pretty good job of it.
I mean, it would be interesting, really, just as a conversation of how we deal with clients that are in the midst of those detoxes or those, prophylaxis and so forth. And, yeah.
See, that's an example. Let's just run with that for example, because Isaac and I, we worked together for many years.
Yeah.
At Endeavour, and so I got to know him. I really like him. He's such an amazing man. But I said to him on a number of occasions, Isaac, your homeoprophylaxis protocol that runs for whatever it is, 4 years for infants. I've sold those remedies to, it could be 500 people.
Wow.
Over the years. Mums that have come and said,
Sure.
You're my homeopath, I want to do this homeoprophylaxis. And I've often said, okay, fine. Or if I've not said that, they're going to say, well, I'm going to go somewhere else and get them.
Right.
So, you might as well still be involved. And I said to him, not one of those people, not one of those mums has ever completed the protocol.
Huh.
Because life gets in the way. And so what do you do? Now, he then started to recognise that, and I think a whole lot of other people started to also say that.
Right.
And so there are now some guidelines within his protocol about if your child has an acute,
Right.
and it's going to get in the way of your next month's homeoprophylactic intervention, then I suggest you do this. But again, it just goes to the heart of how incredibly difficult it is to manage cases.
Right.
When you've got a protocol, take this, then take that, then take that. But then you've got life. And so life is that then you get the flu, or life is that then you get a reaction to the blah, blah.
Well, and also there is the way in which the posology and the assumptions of reactions and Herxheimer reactions and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And, looking at that, I think, oh boy.
Was that your stomach, or was that just
No,
a thought?
that was just me making noises as I'm trying to think something through. I want to table this because it's a very big discussion, and it's also I don't think it's up to me to make a judgment about how people
No.
are, and I know you don't think that either, but I want to make sure I think something through before it seems like.
But it's totally appropriate to
opinion.
think about the challenges that we face as a consequence of blah,
Totally.
blah, blah.
Yeah. It's, and I think as time goes by, if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago, I would be having a different one. 10 years ago, a different one. And I think we sit in such a different point in time now with the popularity of homeopathy and the sort of American spirit of I can do it myself, which I, often compare to home spleen surgery with the undertakings that, people are getting into with, home management of complex issues and the lack of seriousness around what's really going on. And I just think we as a community have a real responsibility, those who are in the professional community, to speak about what it's really like to manage these cases, and that these conversations that go on about, oh, I gave one remedy and I cured, problematic language there, some, ALS or whatever. I mean, come on. We were at a conference once where you and I.
Wasn't that amazing?
Yeah, so this was some years ago. I don't want to get specific because I don't want the person to be identified, but it was a rather large conference, and Alastair and I presented on complex autoimmunity and the homeopathic interventions, and I presented a case that was 9 years of follow-up to resolution, 4 remedies over time. It included a lot of lifestyle modifications. It was a lot of case management, and it was a realistic look at what homeopathy, what homeopathic practice looks like in helping people through these complex situations. And after that evening, we were sitting in a restaurant, in the hotel restaurant, with a group of friends, and this person who apparently presented either right before or right after us made claims to many miracles.
Autoimmune
miracles, one remedy. She'd give a remedy and the person would get out of their wheelchair and run a marathon. And I was just like, and she's telling us this. And she was trying to school us at the table in front of a bunch of people how if we just did her method, we could cure the masses and not waste a lot of time. And she was quite forceful. Do you remember that?
I do.
Thank God I don't remember her name. And anyway, it was shocking to me.
Let me tell you about my experience this week, which is in line and completely congruent with the same conversation.
Oh, good.
So,
because when we go rando, that's hard for people to follow.
So, can I name names?
Use first name.
Well, shout out to Katie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Katie's a student of ours.
In the Taco Tuesday cohort.
Right.
So if you know, you know.
And every now and again, after a particularly, I'd say good lecture, you get an email. And the conversation went back and forth because she was asking a couple of things and about a lecture that I'd given on the method of Isiaga.
Yep.
Francesca Isiaga.
Explain who he is, please.
So, he was, I think he's born 1921, died in 1980.
Argentinian?
No. Died in 2001.
Okay.
So I think he was in the 80s when he died. I might have messed up those dates. And Argentinian urologist, professional, medical homeopath, hitting his straps in his work life in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and taught extensively all throughout Europe and North America when he wasn't back in Buenos Aires, and teaching mainly in Spanish and broken English, and then writing. So if you're a homeopath in the Spanish-speaking world, you read and learn from Isiaga's translations of the books. And he would consistently say, I never met him, but he would consistently say, you Kentian homeopaths are messing this up. You are consistently trying to include in your analyses symptoms of the person.
Yeah.
Symptoms relate, yes,
And I love this about
from a
him.
homeopathic point of view. Symptoms related to the eccentricities and idiosyncrasies and characteristic features of the person, as well as the clinical entity, as well as the,
Right.
in his language, lesion.
Yeah.
And stop doing it.
Yeah.
And then he just laid out pretty beautifully, and then changed his mind a couple of times. But he laid out a system,
Yeah.
a model of prescribing focused firstly on what's the problem. It's virtually the same as Berningshausen.
Except that he says, do it in this order.
And then he says, do it in this order.
Yeah.
Hit the clinical entity first, and that might take 3 minutes, or it might take 5 months or 5 years before turning your attention to the fundamental aspects of the case, or the fundamental layer.
Yeah.
And then interestingly, and this is what Katie and I were talking about, the fact that he then said, then the constitutional layer, and then the miasmatic
Right.
features. And the miasm came last. Now, there's a couple of critiques of that system, because it's been turned into, of course, a protocol, but I don't believe that's what he really meant by it.
Right.
But he was making such a brilliant point that you make every day, all the time, but you don't use that language.
I say fungible totality.
Fungible. You say, yeah, exactly. And that was the next part of the conversation. And at the end of it, I got this email back from Katie, and it just went, are you therefore, it wasn't are you therefore saying, it's that, therefore, what I've understood is that this.
Uh-huh.
And I went, yes.
Yeah.
Are you then saying this? Yes.
And then she demonstrated it in clinic the next day.
Oh, right. You were in
clinic
with her in
Wednesday
clinic.
and Thursday.
Yeah.
And she asked, and not even asked questions, clarified her thinking
Yeah.
of what she had learned in her lecture, demonstrated in the clinic the next morning. That's why I love our program, is that that's what students get to do.
Right.
But here's the thing.
But isn't it nice? Hang on, one more thing.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing when you get to see that the teaching has been learned?
Oh my gosh, yes.
When people ask great questions and clarify things, and the little light goes off on in their eyes, and you go, "Oh, nice work, well done."
And in her case in particular, she's a licensed medical professional. She's got a high-level specialty, which means that she has to use her allopathic decoder ring more often than others. And she's really, I'm just always impressed by the ways in which she's integrating that information.
Yeah.
Now, the Isiaga thing, it's interesting because I have, like with a lot of this methodology, as a, oh gosh, I was going to say as a Hahnemannian scholar, and that sounds so pompous.
Wow. Well,
I know, right?
when you put it on that accent, it sounds a little pompous.
I can't believe that came out of my mouth. That's
Well,
really
you are,
funny.
actually.
I mean, technically, I suppose. But I really want to understand what it is that we do. I feel like it's so important.
Yeah.
And where I call, I guess I was about to say where I call BS, which is not really kind. But I believe that the understanding, the sort of attempts to understand Hahnemann's chronic diseases lies at the heart of things. And so as soon as Isiaga says, then you remove the miasm
With a nosode.
Well, so first of all, that's wrong.
Well, it's a different interpretation of Hahnemann.
I'm going to say that's wrong.
Okay.
I don't think that. It's not, that's like, it's going back to where we started with an isopathic thing. There's no such thing as removing a miasmatic block with a nosode. It's made up. It does not exist. A nosode is just like any other remedy, and the provings are spurious. How do you say that?
Spurious. Yeah, that works.
Okay. At best. Right? And the source material. So I think we have to be very careful when we're doing this. And I think it just creates a whole different problem in teaching and in helping people to really make the best impact on chronic diseases. Mm-hmm. But what I like about I love the point at which you teach Isiaga in the curriculum, not to say do this, and I find it really difficult when students can't see through. This is why I said to write this about implied consent, because then, another student might come and say, oh, Alastair said you do the miasmatic layer last, and it's like, no, he didn't. Right? I mean, it's tough when you get misunderstood. But what I love about where it comes in the curriculum is that it allows people to see. So, like, I feel like you have to hear something in multiple ways to get it. And so, even though I don't agree with the entire methodology of Isyaga, he says so clearly there are different ways to see or perceive totality. And he says that Kentian model has gotten misappropriated.
Totally.
And this is where, if we're going to go to how the protocol thing took hold in America, is that, it was said people are prescribing on these big, lofty totalities and not addressing something very foundational like a cough. All true. But that doesn't mean that homeopaths can't do all these things. So a well-skilled homeopath would recognize, do you open the case with the lesion layer? What does that mean, right? Sometimes we see that there is a small totality issue that needs to be addressed. Sometimes it's a very large totality. Sometimes a case is solved on the simple language. Sometimes it's the physical generals. Sometimes the miasm screams so loudly that you know that you need to use what Hahnemann would call an anti-miasmatic remedy in order to address the problem. But they don't come up in a particular order. And so when you become rigid or dogmatic in an approach, then you can't really solve the problem.
And therefore, the skill is to have the capacity to see and perceive an expanded or a contracted totality.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the skill becomes have the ability to see the elasticity of that.
That's right.
And
the elasticity of the vital
appropriately.
Force as well,
Yeah.
right? Which then impacts posology. And that's why, in developing a program, in how do you teach students to be successful in practice, we've got to get beyond sort of single methodology teaching. That's why I said today I would love to just use your method book as a launching point for a conversation, because I think by acknowledging and teaching about the methods, not do the methods, but about them, students can then extract what the best intention was from every idea that a great thinker has had about homeopathy, see it through the lens of the laws of nature on which homeopathy is based, and make sound clinical decisions to help people get better. Right? And that's what our students do. Oh my gosh. Just reflecting on what a week at AHE is like to give an example. So if you're a person who's listening to this and you're thinking, how do people become a homeopath? And there are a lot of different ways, including people who are, as I heard somebody describe recently, podcasting information and not having to do clinical training, and then prescribing for people with actual, making homeopathic recommendations for people who are actually sick. It shouldn't be that way. So if you look at what we're trying to do is to give people the opportunity to learn as much as they possibly can. So this week we had, we teach 6 different cohorts. So live classes took place. We would have taught, 4, 6, how many classes? 8 classes. So 8 sessions, plus acute clinic, chronic clinic, a whole bunch of follow-ups. There's a fireside chat happening right now with Luke Norlin teaching, helping people with repertory skills using Radar Opus. We would have had 3 events talking about homeopathy, plus the podcast. We were supposed to do a podcast with Eugenie last night. It was going to be at 10 o'clock, and thank God she had mercy on me when I said, there's no way I'm going to be awake and able to talk. But, really sort of being in it and talking about homeopathy, helping people to sort of make, good decisions, and then working with the community. At noon today, we have one of our advocacy meetings, a collaborative group of stakeholders in multiple homeopathy organizations coming together to help the profession forward, right? So I think, as we wrap this up, this podcast is a way to expose people to how to really critically think about homeopathy, how to understand the challenges that we face, but also how to solve them. And, while we, are known as educators in the field, we also have a foundation, and I think that actually constitutes the bulk of our work. Home Foundation is about all the clinical aspects of the work that we do. So Homeopathy Help Now, the Homeopathy Help Network. It's about the research that we do. Oh, we didn't even talk about having research meetings this week and moving projects forward, working on articles, right? Conducting all the research that we do. But, Home Foundation is kind of is what sponsors this podcast. It is a part of our, service to the community to keep the conversations going. And why I say that is because, even if you are, at a different school, you run a different school, that it doesn't mean that we're on different pages. It means that we're having conversations and we want to include everyone. When we come together and work with our commonalities and our shared experiences, we really can do a better job at bringing homeopathy back to its rightful place in medicine. You're just nodding at me.
There's nothing to say. I've got one final thing to say.
Is it about the cricket?
No, okay. It's about the title of the book.
And?
Because I've got a mate in Australia, Dr. David Levy.
Yeah.
And he said, use the right word. And I said, what do you mean? He says, it's a method. Methodology is the study of methods.
Yeah.
And so he was all up in my grills about the use of the term, like Ian Watson's book, Guide to the Methodologies. It's not Guide to the Methods.
I like it. And then did he say, and I suggest you have the longest subtitle possible?
That's funny.
That makes the book seem even more important when you've got like a big explanation. Hey, thanks for listening to it.
All right.
I heard people take us on their walks. Dasha said we are her walking partners. So by now, Dasha, I hope we got your heart rate up. And and anybody else who's having a walk, now listen to some music. Sing along.
All right, folks. Take it easy.
Have a great week.
See you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
AHE is changing the face of homeopathy education by raising the bar through rigorous academics and unparalleled clinical training delivered live through the soulful use of cutting-edge technology. AHE prepares its students to become fully rounded homeopathic practitioners from anywhere in the world. Apply today and ask about the early enrollment discount at ahe.online.